All right, so before we jump into things here today, a couple things I want to mention before we dive into material. So I think I'll have this set, and so if anyone wants to test me, I know I have a way that I can do this manually, but it should be that once the due date passes for a quiz, you are then able to look at your answers, right, and the correct answers. So you won't be able to do that until after the due date passes. So like for last week's quiz, if you were trying to look at your responses, it won't show them to you until after that due date passes. So it should show them to you today. If it's not, and anyone wants to check right now, if you let me know, I'll make sure I go on and manually change the setting and make sure that it's kind of doing that moving forward. But I think the way that's set up now, it should be that you can view those once the due date is passed. The due date is now passed. Okay. Other than that, I mentioned week one, some additional tutoring hours that are available over in Wiley. So I put a link up, and so those have the accurate times. But I think the first week they might have been from last semester. They hadn't updated them yet. I'll get an announcement up that gives you kind of the updated time that those will be available to you. They're on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights. Very similar to the hours that I mentioned week one, but they've changed them a little bit. So I just want to repost those to you, make sure that you're aware of those. I'll also, in that announcement, likely put my updated office hours this week. So I didn't have office hours yesterday. I'm going to add an hour in the morning tomorrow and then 2 hours on Friday. So just kind of making sure I have the same number of office hours this week if you do want to stop by and have any questions. Other than that, the other thing I wanted to mention was I put up an announcement about this after last class. So I released that Canvas discussion, that very first one. So we talked about this week one, right? You'll kind of go through my initial prompt, and it has a bunch of different questions related to this topic of what productivity in ChatGPT. You will respond to my initial prompt, answer one or a couple of the questions I had phrased there, kind of whatever direction you want to take this. And then you'll look at this data source that I gave you and try to kind of tie that into, or kind of look at some of the, very basic, right? Just kind of some OECD data. You can look at things by sector. You can look at development. Find something on here in some market, whether that's the healthcare market. You could look at different kind of measures of productivity. Just kind of play around that database a little bit and try to find something that you believe is a statistic that kind of supports, goes against, or would kind of tie into that discussion or your initial post to my prompt. Both of those things, your initial post and tying in that data, is worth a total of 10 points. You would then respond to 2 other students' posts, each one being worth 5 points. Okay? So if you have questions on that, office hours are a good time to ask those questions this week. People have been asking me about, what does the length need to be? As long as you can give me a well thought out idea and response, that's what you need to have. That could take 4 or 5 sentences. You could write 20 and it could be complete nonsense, which is why I'm not giving you like a number of sentences or words you need. It just needs to be a well thought out, on topic reply to that initial post, and then tying in the data to whatever you posted. Okay. Other than that, I think that should take care of kind of housekeeping stuff. Are there any questions for me before we jump into week 3 kind of slides here? Yeah, so I will, this is just part of, I can't control the weather or kind of whether those happen, but I'm going to try to add an additional CL session around right after that first midterm exam. So you'd have the same number of opportunities if you were planning to go and couldn't go yesterday. I'll have more information about it as we get closer to it, just looking at the schedules of the CL leaders that I have. But I am going to try to make the kind of replacement CL sessions that are available in the next couple of weeks. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we kind of keep moving here, dive into material here today? Okay. So what we start doing this week is going to set us up for basically the rest of the semester. This is a very important week. Can't stress that enough. So we're going to talk about markets, specifically every market that we're going to be looking at in this module, and we'll kind of build on this. We'll change it later on the semester, but we're going to assume we're looking at competitive markets. In fact, not just competitive, we're going to assume we have perfectly competitive markets. So what a perfectly competitive market means is that we have many buyers and many sellers of a good, right? So if you think about how this could be violated, might be an easier way to think about this. If I had, I don't know, Mendoza's game-worn jersey signed for the national championship game, there's only one of those. If I have that and I'm trying to sell it, I'm the only seller of that. What am I likely to be able to do? Set a very high price, right? I have a lot of control over the price. Now, if I'm selling, I don't know, red t-shirts, well, if I increase the price by a lot, what are people going to do? Buy red t-shirts from somebody else. There's a lot of competition, a lot of sellers, a lot of people wanting to buy this good. So that's the market we're thinking about, perfectly competitive markets. No one person or no one firm can set the price, right? There's many options to buy this good. There's many options of who you want to sell this good to, okay? So we're thinking about these perfectly competitive markets. We're first going to talk about primarily demand today. We'll get to supply, but we're really going to focus on demand to kind of set us up. So when we talk about demand, it's a lot easier for us to think about this because most of us are consumers. Most of us buy things. Most of us don't sell things. We're not producers. So when we think about demand, this is going to be how much someone is willing and able to buy, right? I'll probably be a little bit lax in my words. First time, just think about the willingness of someone to buy something, right? So we've got this law of demand that says as the price of a good goes up, generally, do you think people are going to want to buy more or less of that good? The price is higher, less, right? They're going to be able to convince either the same person they're not going to buy as much as before, or fewer people are going to want to buy that good. So we have this inverse relationship between price and the quantity demanded of that good, right? As we increase the price, the demand or the quantity demanded for that product will fall, or if I lower the price, the quantity demand is going to go up. They're kind of working in opposite directions, right? So we have this law of demand that tells us this relationship, and it's fairly intuitive, right? Now we'll kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive behind the scenes here in a second as to why that exists, but I can give you some intuition or some basic explanation that we'll kind of talk about today. We're also going to focus on it a lot more on Thursday. But really what's driving this relationship are two effects. When I have more money, right? Do you think more likely to buy it? Or if I have more money, am I more or less likely to buy something? More, right? So when prices are higher, let's say the price of a new car is $100,000. It's not just that I'm willing to buy that good, it's that I'm able to. So if the price of the car is $100,000, I'm only making $50,000 a year. Am I able to probably buy that car? No, there's an income effect. That price is such a high proportion of my income, I can't buy that product. Now, as they lower the price, if it goes all the way down to $10,000, well, now I have enough money to buy that. So part of what drives this relationship between price and quantity demanded is going to be that changes in price impact the value of your income, right? Or how much you're able to afford. Now, the substitution effect would be if all of a sudden Ford increases its prices by a lot, what are people going to do? Not buy a Ford, be more likely to buy a Chevy, Nissan, whatever company, or whatever other car company you're thinking about. That would be the substitution effect. So that also drives the fact that if a company is increasing their price, consumers are less likely to buy that product. So that drives this inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. Once again, we'll talk more, focus more on these two effects in Thursday's class, but for now, we're just kind of stating them to kind of think about this. Okay. So when I'm thinking about demand, I can kind of set this up. So I use Zoolander as my example here for today. So if I've got this drink, orange mocha frappuccinos, maybe Starbucks is selling these, we're going to have what we call a demand schedule. It's the different combinations of price of this good and the quantity demanded from an individual. So as I start to increase the price, what should happen? The person is willing to buy less, or the quantity demanded goes down. Okay. Now I could set this up. If I have a table, what can I always do? Turn that table into a graph, right? Now, when we draw out the supply and demand curves, or when we draw out these markets, as we start talking about them throughout the semester, what we'll always put on our x-axis is the quantity of the good we're looking at. What's going to be on our y-axis is the price. Okay? So if I start to think about what I'm doing here, I could take these values and say, okay, I've got the quantity of this good. I've got the price. Okay, let me make sure these values line up. I think on the table I was told when the price is 0, right, people are willing to buy 12 of this good. So you might be able to think about, well, why isn't it infinite? If the price is 0, don't I just want as much as possible? Well, theoretically, maybe for some goods, but for most goods, if I have these goods, they're still going to get costly, right? If I drink more than 13 of a drink with milk in it, I'm probably going to throw up, right? I don't want to consume past that 12 drink. Or why don't I want a $100,000 car or 100,000 cars at the price of 0? Because I got to pay to store them, right? I have to do these other things. So there's likely going to be some point where demand, right? It's not that it's going to be infinite. Now we look at the other combinations. If the price goes up to $1, we could get from that table, well, now the person is only willing to buy 10 of this good, right? And then if the price was $2, we were told they're only willing to buy 8. If we connect all these points, essentially what that demand schedule or that table is telling us is this is our demand curve. It tells us the different combinations of price for this good and the quantity that someone would demand of this product. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? So we'll come back to this. And I really kind of already constructed this for us, so I'll go through this pretty quick. All right, all I'm doing here is plotting these different points of price and quantity, drawing a line between these points, and that's my demand curve. Okay. If I have a curve, what's always behind the line on a graph? An equation. Okay. So if I have a demand curve, I'm going to keep everything for the sake of right now, and really what we do throughout the semester. I might mention towards the end that things might not be linear, but anything we have to solve or work through, we're going to keep everything linear. So we're going to use this nice linear curve to represent demand, which means in any math class, what's this? How do how would you represent a line? Y is equal to mx plus b. Well, for us, what is y? Y is going to be the price of our good. What is our x? It's the quantity demanded of that product. Now here we're going to have some intercept. I called it a instead of y equals mx plus b. We're just going to think about here's my intercept, here's my slope. Okay. Now, why is the slope of my demand curve always negative? Because if I want someone to buy more of this product, I want the quantity demand to go up. What's going to happen to the price? It's going to have to go down. So I have this negative relationship between the two. So our demand curve, our slope should always be negative. Okay. Now the intercept is going to represent that y-intercept is the price where someone would be willing to buy nothing. Right. So I'll go back to my graph in a second. Our y-intercept would be if the price ever gets to be this high, nobody or this specific individual is not going to be willing to buy this good. Okay. And then as I lower the price, they'll start to buy more and more of it, right? There's this inverse relationship. I'm lowering the price, their quantity demand is going to increase. Okay? So I could think about, in my example, how do I come up with this value of slope, or how would I come up with this demand equation? So we went back here. If I hit this hard enough, there we go. The price where the quantity demanded was 0 was 6. So that y-intercept is going to be, right, or that price where someone's buying 0 is my y-intercept. Now, if I have any 2 points on this graph, I could use the 2 extreme points. It might be easy, but just to make this point, I could use any 2 points in this graph since we're letting demand be linear. How do I find slope? The change in y over the change in x. What's my y? Change in the price of whatever x good we're looking at. What is my x? A change in the quantity of whatever good we're looking at. So between these 2 points, what's the change in price? It's going down by $1. What's the change in quantity? It's going up by 2. So my slope would be -1/2. If I have any 2 points on this demand curve, so we're keeping it linear, I can calculate that slope. So what that slope is telling me is that in order to sell one more unit, I'm going to have to lower the price by half a dollar or 50 cents. Now, we can also start to think about, what does this curve tell me? What does this demand curve tell me? If I'm buying 8 units, the first price where I'm willing to buy that 8th unit would be at $2. When do you choose to do something? When the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. What is the price to the consumer? When I buy something, the price would be the marginal cost. That's the amount of additional dollars I have to spend to buy one more unit. So it must be that in order to buy that 8th unit, if the price is 2, it has to be that the marginal benefit, that's the first price where it's equal to my marginal benefit. Or, since price represents marginal cost, it's that first marginal cost to the consumer that would be equal to the marginal benefit. So our demand curve, the price really reflects to us, this is the first price the consumer is willing to buy that good. That means that must be the price where that's their marginal benefit. That's the first point where those would be equal to each other. So you can think of that price is really reflecting to us the marginal benefit of different units. So let's say I wanted to know, what would the price have to be for that 4th unit to be consumed? All I would do is plug in what unit I'm interested in finding the price of into my demand equation, right? So 4 times 1/2 is 2. 6 minus 2, we would have a price of $4. That's the first price where someone would be willing to buy the 4th unit. Or said differently, it must be that for that 4th unit, the marginal benefit is $4 to that consumer. And I could do this for any quantity image. I could find the marginal benefit of the 2.76 unit. All I would do is plug in 2.76 in that quantity, and that price for the consumer, the price from our demand curve, is reflecting that consumer's marginal benefit. Because it's the first price they're willing to buy the good at, it would be the first price that is equal to their marginal benefit. And if the price goes any lower, well, now they'll still buy that good because now the marginal benefit is still greater than that price. So our demand curve reflects the consumer's marginal benefit. So I'll write this out a lot. When I'm drawing out demand curves, right next to it, I'll write marginal benefit, or is equal to marginal benefit, because that's really what the demand curve is telling us. The marginal benefit of each single unit that we're looking at here. The first, the second, the third, the fourth, etc. Now, this ties into what we've already talked about before, because what should be happening? I used buying a car to do an extreme example. As you buy more of something, what's happening to the marginal benefit? We said it's going down. If the demand curve represents the marginal benefit, as someone buys more of something, what's happening to the price they're willing to pay? It's going down. Why are they willing to pay less? Because for every unit they buy, its additional benefit to them is going down. I'm willing to pay a lot more for that first car than I am for the second. Well, hopefully we're starting to see we can connect what we're talking about to like things we've talked about prior. Any questions on anything I've said here before we keep moving? I know we're going through this a little bit quick, but that's because I want to make sure we have time Thursday to go through some more difficult concepts, spend a little more time on this. Okay? All right. So, with this idea in mind, right? We know that kind of that demand curve is representing our marginal benefit. It's declining. I talked about we could find a marginal benefit of any quantity we want by simply plugging that quantity into our demand curve, and the corresponding price would tell us that marginal benefit of that unit. So if you go back, I think I did it for 4. You could do it for the first, second, or third, right? In fact, notice for the first drink, it was $5.50, second 5, third $4.50, and once we got to the fourth, it was 4, right? It continues to decline. Okay? So now let's think about, we're going to move from an individual's demand curve to what we call the market demand. So if I have one individual, the Quantity demanded is how much I could sell if that's the only person who's in the market, the only person willing to buy my product. But if I have two people and I say, okay, look, Zoolander at these different prices, this is how much he's willing to buy. If I have a second person, Ken, and at these same prices, here's how much he's willing to buy. How do you think I would come up with then at all these prices, if these are the two individuals' demand curves, how would I come up with the market demand? At each price, I'd simply add them up. If I charge a price of $2, Zoolander's going to buy 8, Ken's going to buy 10, so the total demand would be 18. So market demand is just the sum of every individual's demand. Now, I just want to make a point here, something we've already talked about. What's the marginal benefit of the 8th drink to Zoolander? Well, we said, how do we determine the marginal benefit? From our demand curve, that is represented by the price they're willing to pay. So what price does Zoolander buy that 8th drink at? $2. So it must be that the marginal benefit of that 8th drink to him is $2. What's the marginal benefit to Ken of that same 8th drink? Well, Ken is willing to buy that 8th drink when the price is $3. So it must be that Ken's marginal benefit to that same 8th drink is $3 or higher than Zoolander's. Right? In fact, at every single price, Ken is willing to buy more, so it must be that he has a higher marginal benefit for this product. So just tying this into the kind of things we've already talked about. Now here, if I think about this market demand curve, so all I've done here is take these prices, take them to market demand, we can plot it the exact same way as we plotted the individual demand. Yeah, so the marginal benefit, right, is how much we would value, right, that good. Now that might depend on if that price is a higher or lower percent of our overall income. So even though I get a little bit lazy, I think when I first start setting up demand, we're thinking about like the willingness to pay. Technically, demand will be the willingness and ability to pay, right? If I raise the price high enough, kind of I'll focus on this more on Thursday, the income effect takes over. If you increase the price of one of these drinks to $100, I don't have enough money to be able to afford that. We're still basing this off what we talked about. How does the consumer make a decision based off their marginal benefits and their marginal costs facing scarce resources, facing this constraint of income? Yep. Good question. Okay. So if I've now got market demand, I could plot that out the same way I was plotting out every individual's demand curve. So we're then going to start to talk about things that shift demand. So I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to jump the gun a little bit here, but I think it makes sense in terms of the context that we'll talk about things. I need to make sure I hit this more often so it doesn't time out on me. Waiting, we're waiting. On, why is it not showing up? There we go. Okay. So if I'm thinking about the quantity of this drink and I had the price, right? Just like before we drew out Zoolander's individual demand curve, well, we said Ken's, the marginal benefit, remember the demand represents marginal benefit. We said his was a little bit higher, right? So I've got like both individual demand curves. How did I get market demand? At every price, I took the quantity demanded of both individuals and I added them up. So my market demands will always be what? Relative to the individual demand curves, it's always going to be higher because I'm looking at the sum of every single person who wants to buy this good. Okay? So what happens now if I add a third person into my market? Well, now market demand will be the quantity of the first person, the second person, and the third person added up. So what's going to happen? At every price, my market demand will now be higher. I have more people in my economy or in my market, So we would see that the demand curve is, for the market now, higher once we added this third person. So here's where, what's happening to my demand curve? At every single price, the quantity demand is now higher, or I've seen a rightward shift in my demand curve. Now, I think it's easiest to think about rightward shifts represent increases in demand. Why? Because as I add more people into my economy, to then calculate market demand, I have more individuals to add up. So this is an easy way to come back to, and remember, this is one thing that would shift my entire demand curve, is if I start adding in more individual demand curves, or I increase my consumer base. This could be as simple as increasing my population, or if I'm a company, what's one way I can increase my consumer base? I had to watch a bunch of them yesterday. I must have not be paying for something anymore, because I was watching YouTube, and every 5 minutes I had to watch some minute-long ad. Right? What do firms do? They market so they can increase the number of consumers. They increase the number of consumers for their product. What happens to the overall market quantity demand for their products? It goes up. So these rightward shifts, another way I kind of tell people to think about them, yes, really it's that at every price, market quantity is now higher than before. But another way to remember why rightward shifts in demand are increases is we're moving further from that 0 point. That's why it's increase. It's not the most technical way of saying it, but it's an easy way to remember, and it will help us once we get to supply. Okay? So you might be like, well, no shit, right? That's very easy to see here. With supply, it'll help you from making a very easy mistake once we get there. Okay? So increases in demand, movements away from this point of 0. Okay? So if I think about what this looks like, we have our demand shifts are going to be changes in anything other than the price of that good. Okay? So changes in anything other than the price of that good are going to increase demand. One of the things that I just mentioned, even if the price stays the same, but I have more consumers, that caused an increase or a rightward shift in demand. Right? So what are some of these other things that could change? We'll start talking through them. So we already kind of went through an increase in demand. One of the things is just having more consumers. What if I have fewer consumers for my product? So let's say I have a product and just for whatever reason, people stop liking it as much or they don't need it as much. So I'll use an example later on. Desktop computers, like you go over to Wiley, most professors don't have one anymore. So, there's those fewer consumers who want this product. What would that do to our demand curve? At every single price, the quantity demanded is now low. So these leftward shifts will be decreases in demand. Okay? Rightward shifts further from this 0 point, increases in demand, decreases in demand, moving us closer to that 0, 0 or that origin point. Leftward shifts will be kind of decreases in demand. So we talked about the number of buyers is going to be one thing that could cause these shifts. Okay? So we'll work through this together, and we'll kind of point out a couple more of these things. But this is where I'm not always going to do these at the end of class. So we've got the in-class quiz for today. All right, I think I've got this set open for about the next 15 minutes. So I want to give you a little bit of time. I'm not going to give you necessarily the answers to question 1. If you've been paying attention, this should hopefully be an easy one, right? You should also, based off of what we talked about, be able to answer question 3. So I'm not going to necessarily review those with you. I'll give you a couple minutes to work on those. You can talk to the people around you. Before you submit this quiz, though, we will talk through questions 2 and 4 together. So do not submit this quiz until after we talk about these. That way you can guarantee you're going to get question 2 and 4 right. So work on question 1 and 3 here for a few minutes. We'll then kind of come together. I'll talk us through or work us through questions 2 and 4. Okay? So give you a couple minutes to kind of work on that. We'll then kind of come together and talk through those other 2. So questions 1 and 3 is what you should. Oh, you probably want the code, right? The code for today is negative 3.14. So you need to put that negative sign in front. Negative 3.14 will get you into that quiz. I think negative 3 was the low last night. And the highest number of snowfall somewhere in Bloomington I saw was 14 inches. So that's how I chose the number. Okay? So generally, when I give you these quizzes, it will often look something like this, where we've worked through or I explained something to you, then you have a question at the end, right? So if you've been paying attention to the discussion, I'm hoping that question 1 will be an easy one. All right, we just talked about it, I reiterated it. Now, question 3, we've actually talked through. I might mention something through the discussion of question 2 and 4 that will kind of help you with that, but you should have been able to answer that one as well. Sometimes when I use these quizzes, for some of the questions, I'll kind of work through it with you, depending on time, how much material we have to cover that week, kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, where you get to kind of think about a question that looks like what I could ask, but then also explain the concept. So here I've got a setup, which was something we haven't talked about yet, that could also cause a shift in our demand curve. So when we talk about shifts in the demand curve, it's changes in something other than the price of that good. If I see a change in the price of the good I'm looking at, that's just going to move me to a different point on the demand curve. So for question 2, I'm looking at ramen noodles and I have a change in income. So we haven't talked through this yet, but I'll kind of give you the setup of how we can answer a question like 2. All right. So in general, if I have income, and if you look out on other resources, I don't usually write it this way. I usually write out the word, but you might see instead of like capital I, there's a reason because of macroeconomics, I represent something else. You'll usually see income represented by M. I won't use that shorthand, but if you're looking at outside resources, you might see that. If I see income go up, for most goods that we think about, we call these normal goods. If you have more income, for most things, do you think you'd be willing to buy more or less than before? More. If I have more income, I'm more likely to buy a new car. Right? If I have more income, I'm more likely to go out to eat at the same place. Maybe instead of going out 2 times a week, I'll go there 4 times a week. So when income goes up, for normal goods, we think about the demand for that product generally increases as well. And then the reverse would be true. If I see decreases in income, for normal goods, I would see people buy less. So when we have like economic downturns, when everyone's income goes down for normal goods, typically we see that people buy fewer products, right? That's why GDP goes down, right? We see companies not able to sell as much because demand, to the question earlier, is not only the willingness to pay, it's the ability. So if people have lower income, the ability to buy these typical goods, it's now lower. So we see the demand shift down. Now, I believe in this question, I gave you something a little bit different, which is what if these are inferior products? So here, and I'd have to tell you, I'm not just going to assume that you know if the good is normal or inferior, but we could gather this from data. So for example, if I see economic downturns, or actually here I started out, let's say economic times are good. Everyone's income is going up. For inferior products, so this is something like public transportation. When you have more money, I said you're more likely to buy a new car or a car. So what are you less likely to now use? Public transportation. So when income goes up and the demand for a product goes down, we call these inferior goods. right? I think I've got a stupid meme on the one slide, right? But when I was in college, I didn't have a lot of income. I drank Natty Ice, right? Or no, cheap beer. Now that I have a higher amount of income, I go to nice breweries, right? I don't buy really cheap beer anymore. What is cheap beer to me? Inferior product. When I have more income, I'm going to buy less of it. Or think about ramen noodles as an example I think I used in the question. I only eat ramen noodles out of necessity because I can't afford anything else, right? As soon as I can afford to go out to eat, I stop buying ramen noodles, right? It's an inferior product. So when income is higher and I buy less of a good, and we can see that in the data, that tells me it's inferior. And then the opposite would be true as well. If I see decreases in income, what will happen to the demand for inferior products? Well, now people are kind of forced to buy those. I have to rely on public transportation, so I have to buy more of that. I can't buy a new car. So for inferior products, income and demand work in kind of opposite directions. Okay? So when we're thinking about question 2, if I had an inferior product and overall we have an economic downturn, income goes down, well then for inferior products, when people have less money, they're going to have to buy more of them. The demand will increase, which a demand increase is a shift to the right. Okay. I'll tell you this one ahead of time before we work through it. So we have changes in the number of consumers and changes in income can cause these shifts. Right? Another thing that can cause shifts in demand is the change in the price of related goods. So here I had, I could either eat SpaghettiOs or ramen noodles. So if the price of SpaghettiOs goes down, I'll buy more of those as I have less noodles. So here we should see there's a decrease in demand for question 4. So I'll work through that here in a second. But in terms of submitting the quiz before 10:15, which is what I have the due date set to be, the answer to question 4 should be B. We kind of talked through the answer to question 2. We said we saw an increase in the demand for inferior products. And along the way, if you've been paying attention, I actually already kind of gave you answers to 1 and 3 if you've been following along. Okay? So I might not give them to you explicitly. I might have you work on questions on your own like this today, and then work through some of them with you together. Okay? So make sure you're getting that quiz submitted in the next minute or 2. Once again, I believe I have the due date set to be 10:15. So make sure you're submitting that before 10:15. Okay? If you don't, I'm going to assume that you were probably what? Not in class. So don't send me, well, not talking to you, but if you're watching the recording, don't send me an email. I know you weren't in class. You've got ample time to get this submitted. Okay? So, I didn't want to hit that. I wanted to hit this. So we can actually talk through why the answer to question 4 was what it was. I believe it was answer B there, right? So let's say I have 2 substitute goods, right? So I had the price of SpaghettiOs, right? I need to have these up. I don't know how to spell SpaghettiOs, something like that, right? And we had substitute goods. So the other good I was thinking about was ramen noodles. So I can choose to buy one of these products. If all of a sudden the price of ramen noodles goes down, well, if I'm choosing what to eat, what do I want to buy? Whatever. Let's say I hate both of these equally, but I have to eat one of them. If the price of SpaghettiOs goes down, what am I more likely to now buy? It's SpaghettiOs. So that means for ramen noodles, I am less likely to buy them, right? When the price of a substitute good goes down, I'm more likely to buy that good, less of the other. Think about it this way. When the price of, say, electric vehicles started to go down, right? What happened to the demand for gas-powered vehicles? Well, if electric vehicles are cheaper, people are going to be more likely to buy electric vehicles, which means they're not going to be buying gas-powered vehicles. The price of the other good that is a substitute, if it goes down, I buy less of whatever it's a substitute for. That's kind of our substitution effect, right? When we see this change, it's just that substitution effect. Right? Now, the exact opposite would be true. So let's think about if I had the price of SpaghettiOs now goes up. Well, I'm less likely to buy SpaghettiOs, and now I'm more likely to buy ramen, right? So we kind of have this inverse relationship when it comes to the price and the demand for substitute goods. I think that one's kind of intuitive. Now, a little bit more of a difficult example, at least for me, it's more difficult, is we have other types of goods which are complements. Okay, so I used this example last class. Maybe, hopefully you like it or agree, but I have a second example just in case. Right. So let's think about the quantity demanded for national championship tickets, right? Or I used the national championship game. That was kind of the good I was thinking about. So let's think about the quantity demanded of tickets here. And instead, I'm thinking about there's a complementary good, which is, I don't know, flights to Miami, right? So I have two goods, and I know there's a relationship between price and the kind of the quantity demanded of the other one. So here, I'll set this up just to kind of be more like we had up here. So let's say the price of a flight to Miami, in order to go to that national championship game, or if I'm thinking about the demand for tickets, well, I guess you could have technically driven there, but most people to get down to Miami probably flew, right? So even if the price of those tickets stays the same, if the price of flights to Miami goes up, what happened to the demand for tickets to that national championship game? It went down, right? Because now if I want to go to that national championship game, these are complementary goods. I can't get there. Let's say I don't have a car. I can't get there without a flight. So if you increase the price of the flight, it's almost like you did what? Increase the price of going to that national championship game, that ticket. So complementary goods, a change in the price of one good, it's almost like I saw a change in the price of the other because I need both of them at the same time. So if the price goes up, I'm going to buy less, or we see a demand decrease.
You say that there are like some exceptions for this because I feel like I don't know the prices of like lobster or something like the fact that it's going up and that's high and it's luxury, but like first class tickets.
So I'm not saying anything. So all things else constant, if I want to go to this game, if the price of luxury tickets goes up, am I more or less likely to go than I was before? Always less likely, right? So it won't change. If they're truly complementary goods, I'll give you a different example, and we'll look at the flip side of this. Let's say instead I'm thinking about the price of electric vehicle batteries, right? Because this one I think is a fail-safe, and I'm looking at the demand for electric vehicles. Over time, so my wife wanted to get this electric vehicle cheap, and the batteries, replacement batteries are relatively expensive, right? But over time, they've started to fall, right? So eventually, as the price of the battery, like I can't use the electric vehicle if I don't have the battery. This is a fail-safe example. They are complementary goods, right? So not everybody might view these as because they might drive. If they're truly just complementary goods, when the price of those batteries went down, what was it like? Well, now if I have an electric vehicle, it's almost like the price to use it has went down. So I want to be more or less likely to buy that electric vehicle. More likely. So that relationship between the price of the complementary good and the demand for the good it's a complement with will always be going in the opposite direction. Now, how strong is that relationship? Some goods are different complements than others. This is like my example of thinking about the strongest complementary. Like I can't use this vehicle without the battery. Now, if you give me the example of like peanut butter and jelly, a lot of people eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, but not everybody does. Some people eat peanut butter sandwiches. They don't need jelly. It's not a complement. So there's different like strengths of complementary goods, but the directional change of the price and demand will always be the same. Yep. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay. So we have now another thing that could shift demand, right? So We'll go back to the slides. We've talked about the number of buyers. We went through this. I've talked through income. You gave my kind of natty light example or natty ice. We talked about the price of related goods. I tried to give you some different examples. There's some additional examples in here that maybe line up with your way of thinking more than just the examples I gave you. But we talked through these. The next thing we'll talk about is changes in expectation. Okay. So I'll talk through these intuitively, and I'll give you a little shorthand way that might help kind of summarize this. But the first one is actually pretty easy. We've actually already talked about it. Works the exact same way. So let's think about income expectations. If I think I'm going to have more money tomorrow, how might I start living today? So I think last class, probably shouldn't say stuff like this, but I was like, let's say I have a relative and I think they're going to die in the next week. And I think they're going to leave me a lot of money. What might I start doing today? Spending a lot, living outside my means, right? So if I think I'm going to have higher income in the future, what types of goods do I buy more of today? Well, luxury, I think the book goes into that. We haven't talked about that yet today. But in general, I just buy more of normal goods, right? Which include luxury goods. Those are in that same category. But I've only kind of defined it. We're just caring about normal versus inferior. Now, if I expect to have more money tomorrow, what am I less likely to buy today? That relationship works the exact same way. Whether I actually have the money or I just expect to have the money tomorrow or in the future. So normal inferior goods, that relationship works the same way with actually having a higher income or just expecting a higher income. In fact, what do people do if they expect to have higher income in the future, which many of you do? What have you done to be here? Taken out loans, right? People do this. If they expect higher income in the future, they take out loans so they can buy more normal goods today, fewer inferior goods, right? They start living like they already have that income. So that doesn't really change anything. It doesn't look a whole lot different, right? It's the same relationship of actually having that higher income or expecting to have that higher income. Now, what does work a little bit different is price expectations. So let's say there's this impending storm coming to Bloomington, and I think that the supply chain is going to be kind of screwed up, and all of a sudden gas prices are going to skyrocket. What might I try to do before that storm gets here? Go buy a bunch of gas, fill up my gas tanks. Thinking the price is going to be higher in the future, this is where it works exactly the opposite of if the current price goes up. If the current price goes up, I'm going to buy less. But if the current price, no matter what it is, if I think the price is going to be higher tomorrow, what happens to my current demand? It goes up. It works the opposite. It's kind of counterintuitive. If I think the price of something is going to be lower tomorrow, what do I want to do? I don't want to buy it today. I want to buy it tomorrow. So if the price I expect it to be lower tomorrow, current demand is actually going to go down. I'm going to want to try to not buy it today and hold out until when the price is low. Right? So that's kind of the intuition. If we're thinking about kind of doing this shorthand, I would say like, okay, if I expect that future prices are higher tomorrow, currently my demand is going to go, if I think the price will be higher tomorrow, today I want to make sure I am buying, right? So if I think about what shifts have occurred, here's the quantity and price of some good. Here's the current demand. If I think that the price is going to be higher tomorrow, we would see a demand increase. So I don't know, call this current 2. If I think that prices are going to be lower tomorrow, then the current demand I'm actually going to see decrease. People don't want to buy it today, they want to buy it tomorrow. So there I would actually see that the demand curve in kind of this third scenario, current demand would decrease if I expect prices to be lower in the future. So expected prices work a little bit different than changes in the current price. Changes in the current price would shift demand which way? Trick question. Changes in current prices do what? Move me to different quantity demanded, different points on the demand curve. Changes in the entire demand curve mean at every single price, the quantity demanded has went up or down. Changes in the current price of the good just move me to different points on the same demand curve. Okay? So this terminology of changes in demand or changes in quantity demanded, changes in demand refer to a shift in the entire curve. Changes in the quantity demanded, just different points on the same demand. No, because what would cause it? Well, if I had simultaneous things changing, so if I had that all of a sudden the current price goes down, but I also think the price is going to be higher in the future or whatever that combination is, then maybe yes, I do. But for the sake of what we're doing, I'll never combine those two things, right? In fact, most what we're doing in all of these things that shift demand, we're just honing in on one cause and effect. In reality, and we'll get to this a little bit next class, we can see simultaneous shifts. So for example, if I think that prices are going to be higher in the future, but I also think that I'm going to have less money in the future, well, the higher prices, right, shifted or increased current demand. But if at the same time I have less money for normal goods, I would see a decrease. I could actually end up with same demand. So if I have simultaneous changes, all bets are off, right? But here, when we're thinking about shifts in the demand curve, we ultimately talk about is changes in equilibrium on Thursday. We're just going to be honing in on one effect. We might dive into like simultaneous effects, but for the most part, at least for right now, we're just thinking about a change in one thing at a time. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So some other things that we'll talk through. Is kind of a catch-all category. So there's one more thing I'll talk about that kind of helps us out with a future module. But other than these things that we've mentioned might shift demand, there's a basic category of like things we can't explain. So like why the hell were fidget spinners a thing for a while and people actually buying them? I don't know. Why was demand anything other than zero? It's the taste and preferences of our people, right? Pet rocks used to be something people bought in the 70s, right? So these seem like dumb examples. Why am I talking about them? Well, what's something else that we actually can influence that would fall under this category? It's not a change in income, not a change in substitute complementary goods or a number of consumers. It's kind of a change in the number of consumers. But what do a lot of companies try to get celebrities to do? Endorse their products. Does that change the actual product itself? Still is whatever it is. But now I've maybe convinced the consumer that it actually has higher value than it does. It's still the same quality product as before, but now because, I don't know, name your celebrity, buys this or uses this product, I've now essentially convinced people it has a higher benefit. I've now increased the number of consumers. So if I can get people to think the value is higher, falls under this kind of catch-all category, I have now increased my overall demand. Right? What can I also do? Maybe I convince people that this company's product is bad. Maybe I associate it with hate crimes, right? I mean, if I'm thinking about trying to make people want to buy my product, I'm going to sabotage another firm. I'm going to convince them, hey, this CEO is a terrible person. They support these terrible things. You should not buy their product. What did I just do? I decreased their demand. Right? It's as simple as that. And when we talk about equilibrium, we'll start to think about the impacts that would have on the price and the quantity sold of that product in the market. Okay? So kind of our catch-all category. Now we also have, and I'll kind of skip over the real intricacies of this because we're going to talk more specifically about it in Module 6. But I want to introduce the idea now of taxes and subsidies and why, eventually we'll, have a pessimistic view. Most economists would, but why the government might not be great, why their actions might cause some inefficiencies in our market. So the first thing that we'll talk through is the idea of taxes, right? So I was thinking about this example. So I grew up in Michigan. If you go up to the state line, like some of the cities there's like they legalized marijuana. It's like there's one little small town right over the state line. I think they've got something like 25 marijuana shops now. I mean, this is a town of like 1,500 people, right? This is insane. Well, the government doesn't just legalize this product out of the goodness of their heart. There is some overall demand whether this product was illegal or not, right? So let's assume it's legalized. What did these states start to do? There are tobacco and alcohol taxes because we know people are really likely to buy them regardless of the price. So if there's something I think people are willing to buy, even if the price is high, they include a tax on that good, right? So if I put a tax on this good, what does that do? It essentially, when you go to the store and you see the sticker price is $6, well, you got to pay sales tax. When you go to buy it, you actually have to hand over $6. You got to hand over that plus whatever the sales tax is, right? So what have I done? If I was willing to buy it when the sticker price was $6 now, well, because there's a tax, you would actually have to lower the price in order for me to buy the same quantity. Or essentially, at every price, you would have to, or at every quantity, you'd have to lower the price, or we would see that the demand curve after this tax, so you can think about here's the original demand curve, here's where it is after the tax. At every single price, I'm now willing to buy less because that's not the price to me. It's that price plus the tax, right? So you've made it now more expensive for me to buy that same quantity. So taxes, essentially, we can think about it as my marginal benefit is whatever it was before paying that price, but now I have to pay this additional tax as well. So it's going to cause taxes, this demand curve plus the tax, it's going to decrease my demand curve. Now, on the flip side of that, if I instead, and this I always like this example because it kind of applies to some of you. Remember, this is not any one individual's demand curve. This is market demand we're now looking at. So if I think about the quantity of higher education and the price, there is some overall demand curve for that, right? I see that there's a certain number of people willing to pay the tuition price to go to IU Bloomington, right? Now, regardless of that tuition price, right, at all these different prices, I have the corresponding market demand. At every one of those prices, what happens to my demand curve? If all of a sudden the government says, you know what, we're going to give out a subsidy to anyone choosing to pursue higher education. If I give consumers money to go to school, are they going to be more or less likely to go than before? At the same price, they're going to be more likely, or there's going to be more people willing to go get higher education at that same price. So instead of taxes, if I give subsidies, what is that going to do? That's going to increase my demand curve or shift it to the right? Because when I give people money for doing something, here's another way of thinking about it. Well, their marginal benefit was whatever it was before. So now if I were to go to school, I get the same marginal benefit, but I get that plus now some money from the government. So the total marginal benefit to me is whatever the marginal benefit was before, plus some additional amount. So when we subsidize products, we increase demand, fairly intuitive. When I tax them, I now see that demand decreases. So that's another category of things that we can see shift supply or demand. We'll focus more on that in module 6. I wanted to start mentioning them here in this module. All right, we'll go dive in, a little more in depth once we get there. But for now, I'm just trying to get us thinking about shifts, increases or decreases in demand. Okay. All right. So here's kind of a summary of all these things we've talked about. Any questions before we kind of start on another topic to set us up for Thursday's class? Okay. So this is, once again, sometimes the book goes a little bit more in depth. So I've already had a couple questions about luxury goods. We haven't talked about those at all today, so I'm not expecting you to know anything about it. Right? We just focused on normal versus inferior goods. So the next thing that we want to start thinking through is we can do everything that we did with demand, but everything gets flipped on its head, right? Now, most of us are consumers. Very few of us are going to be suppliers or producers of the good. But if I was thinking about, instead of quantity demanded, I think about the quantity supplied. If I'm selling a product, the price to me is a good thing. The price to the consumer was their cost. When I sell a good, the price to me as a producer is my benefit. So we can think about there's now a relationship between price and the quantity supply. If I increase the price, is a firm going to be willing to supply more or less than they were before? More. If I can sell something for more, I'm going to want to sell more of it, right? Or if I can now, the price of a good goes up, there are now going to be more firms willing to take their resources to produce that good, okay? So this is why over time, as more people want to go to higher education, what have we seen? The number of universities has increased, right? I mean, we have kind of our old ones, but there's tons of new universities that have popped up over the years. So unlike demand, we have this relationship between price and quantity supply that is positive. As I increase the price, I will see that the amount of drinks that Starbucks wants to provide is going to go up. Now, just like with demand, I can calculate slope, right? So if I wanted to instead think about, okay, I have this supply schedule, I could put that into a graph, just like we did for demand. I've got price. I've now got on my x-axis still quantity, but it's going to be the quantity supplied of that good, right? So if I have these different combinations of price and quantity supplied, I can graph those out and I get this nice supply curve. Now, for the sake of this example, I started it out at 0 was my y-intercept. So essentially, if the price was 0, how much am I going to be willing to buy the market? Nothing. Can't make any money. Now, what could be the case is that my y-intercept is not 0. So let's think about why. If instead I had something like space shuttles, right? If I raise the price from like 0 to 50 cents, maybe Starbucks is willing to start selling a few drinks. If I raise the price of a space shuttle from 0 to 50 cents, how many space shuttles am I still willing to provide? 0, right? You're going to have to, the price is going to have to go up quite a bit. So my y-intercept is likely not 0 in most cases, but it could be, right? It's likely it's going to start out higher, especially for goods that require more money to build them, okay? So this kind of starts to get at the idea of if demand represented the marginal benefit to me, the price that I'm willing to first to supply that first unit to the market, it must be the first price. So what is the price to a firm? It is the marginal benefit. So it must be that that is the first price that was greater than or equal to my marginal cost. So the demand curve reflected the marginal benefit. The supply curve is going to reflect the firm's marginal costs. So if I think about taking this equation or this graph, right, this supply curve, how could I find the slope of my supply curve? It's still the change in y over the change in x, which is the change in the price over the change in quantity supply. Once again, I could choose any 2 points. Moving from this price to this price, the change in price would be $1. Change in quantity is 3. The slope here would be positive. Whoops, if I can move this out of the way. 1/3. So I can find the slope of my supply curve. This is all very similar to what we're doing with the demand curve. It's just now my slope is not negative. It is always going to be positive, right? Price is a good thing for producers. So as the price goes up, they want to supply more to the market. Okay. Any questions on this before we go a little bit further here?
First, we mentioned that like price of their resources.
Price of their
resources. The suppliers, like the price of a certain goods goes up. We're assuming that what they're buying is
we're assuming all else constant. So it's just a change in the price they can sell that good. In fact, I think what you're getting at is if this is my supply equation, when I want to supply the first unit to the market, who did I rely on to build that in my company? The most efficient worker. So that first unit I'm going to be able to produce it at a very low cost. If I want to produce the second unit, I now have to start relying on less efficient workers, or that second unit is going to make, or it's going to, maybe the second unit, I don't have to hire one person, I now have to hire two. So my cost for providing the second unit is now going to be higher. So if the supply curve represents marginal cost, we said because I have to start relying on less and less efficient workers, the marginal cost of producing something is going to increase. We have the diminishing returns or diminishing marginal benefits. We also have increasing marginal costs, right? So the demand curve represented these diminishing marginal benefits. The supply curve is going to be reflecting the fact that the firms have increasing marginal costs. Okay, so we're assuming that those input costs have stayed the same. It's just that I can sell this product. So in fact, if you wanted to, if I think about now, I've got this supply equation. I think I kind of started out with something like this. So I quantity supplied. What would be the price that I would have to be able to charge in order to sell the fifth unit? All I would do, just like when I wanted to figure out what price would consumers be willing to pay, I plugged 5 into my demand curve. If I want to know the price, the first price that this company is willing to supply the unit, that fifth unit, I just plug 5 into my supply equation. So I go ahead and I say, okay, the price they'd be willing to supply that fifth unit at would be what? About $1.66. Okay. Now, just like with demand, that price tells me if this is the first price I'm willing to supply this good at, this would represent the firm's marginal costs. As I start to plug in higher values, because my slope is positive, what's going to be happening to the first price that I'm willing to supply a higher number of units at? Or what's happening to the marginal cost of higher units? If I'm multiplying this number by a larger value, it's going to get larger and larger, or my marginal costs are increasing. Or if we think about, as I want to supply more of this good, the price that I'm going to need to be able to charge has to be higher. That supply curve is representing that I need a higher price in order to go from producing 1 or selling 1 to 2 units, because what is increasing as I produce more? My marginal cost. I'm only going to sell this good if the price is greater than or equal to my marginal cost. So if you want me to sell more of this product, you're going to have to increase the price, or I'm going to have to be able to sell it for a higher price, because as I produce more, it's requiring more and more of my resources, right? Or I'm able to produce this less and less efficient. I've used all my efficient workers. I'm now having to rely on less and less efficient workers, and it's costing me more to produce these really high units, or high number of units. Okay? So just like when I wrote out the demand curve, I said it represents the consumer's marginal benefits. The supply curve represents the producer's marginal costs.
So the points on the supply curve, like the break-even price at that quantity supply?
You can think of it as, because it's the first price I'd be willing to supply this good, if the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, going ahead a little bit here, but I think about kind of like what was the amount of money I made? 0. It was the point that I'm indifferent at. If I think about in reality, what are firms doing? If I keep charging the same price, so let's say I have a price of $5 here. Well, what's the price to the firm? It's their marginal benefit. And I was telling you the marginal cost represents the marginal cost. The supply represents their marginal cost. So for that first unit, is the marginal benefit, the price I'm charging, greater than the marginal cost? The marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost? Yes. So I sell the first unit. If I keep charging $5, right, that's the price I'm selling the good for in my store. Is that greater than the marginal cost of the second unit? Yes. So I sell the second. If I go up to like, oh, I don't know what this would be, where would we get 5? This would have to be something like, I don't know, 15 or something. Oh, that's exactly right. Sorry, I got the numbers right there. It was just new intuition. At that 15th unit, what would the marginal cost be? Well, if I plug 15 into my supply curve, I get the first price I'd be willing to supply that 15th unit at would be $5. I'm indifferent at that point. How much money am I making off the 15th unit? 0. That's our indifferent point. It's the very first price I'm willing to supply that good to the market at. If I have a price any higher than that, well, then for sure I'm going to sell, right? Now the marginal benefit is greater than or equal, it's greater than the marginal cost. But here is that point where they're equal, where I'm indifferent, right? I understand why that's a little bit tricky to think about because it's like, well, I'm breaking even. I could supply it, I could not. You're right. But we always go up to the point where they're equal because we say, we know they're going to supply everything up to this quantity. This quantity, essentially, we could see it supplied, we could not, but we know they'll never go past that point at the current price. Okay. Does that help a little bit? Yeah.
Reality, like how, I assume they don't change their price based on every single product. So it is just stab. Because I just say if I'm selling like bars, if it was a full one, that's.
Oh, so what?
Like I want one more.
I got what you're saying. So now we haven't talked about how we arrive at this price yet. That'll be Thursday. We look at the combination of supply and demand and talk about something called equilibrium. I think your point is I don't usually have truly linear supply and demand because I can't sell half the car. Is that your question?
Yeah, but also like cars that you know are a certain price, like the bar.
Mm-hmm.
The band, I feel like band's low or it goes up high, like usually relatively once.
The demand or the price?
Price.
Yeah, so
less of a profit.
So we could think about what must be true. If the price of a product doesn't change very often, it's likely that what is happening to demand for that product. We haven't talked about equilibrium, but it's likely that demand isn't changing, right? Or we have some combination of factors that are changing that kind of keep it at the same point. But yeah, I mean, when you see, we see this all the time. Like, what happens to most prices over time? Even candy bars, they go up. Why? What has happened to consumers' income over time? It's always going up, right? So we're going to see these things play out. It might not be as dramatic, or we might not see a huge increase, but we would still see kind of these shifts. Yep. Okay. So here's kind of how we're thinking about the supply curve. We said it represents marginal costs. We'll talk next class about things that will shift our supply curve, just like we did with demand. So because we kind of already talked about demand, I'm likely going to move through those supply shifts pretty quickly. So if you want to look at those slides ahead of time, that might be helpful before Thursday's class, because what I really want to focus on Thursday is equilibrium, right? It'll be the combination of supply and demand. Our supply shifters will look very similar to some of our demand shifters. So maybe looking at those slides ahead of time, I think you'll probably be able to figure it out on your own, but it'll also allow class time to be a little more efficient. So what we're going to start with next class, or what shouldn't say start with, but what we're really going to focus on is we're going to start putting supply and demand on the same graph. They have the same X and Y axis, price and quantity. Demand is always going to reflect consumers' marginal benefits or the marginal benefits that exist in that market. Supply is always going to represent marginal cost to the producers or the marginal cost of supplying that good in that market. I may start to not always write that out. It might be helpful to you as we discuss more topics to always think about that. When you're writing out the demand curve, it represents consumer marginal benefits. When we're drawing out this supply curve, it represents the producer's marginal costs. So next class, we'll talk about things that shift the supply curve. We'll then kind of look at the combination of supply and demand to figure out, well, why is the price of a candy bar $1.50 or whatever it is, okay? So other than that, stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you guys on Thursday.
I 1 second.